In the year 1847, inside a hospital in Vienna, women were dying after giving birth at a rate that should have been impossible in a building full of doctors. Nearly 1 in 5 new mothers who passed through the first maternity ward never left it alive, struck down by a violent fever within days of delivery. Down the hall, in a second ward staffed only by midwives, the death rate was a fraction of that. No one could explain the gap until a young physician named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed that doctors were walking straight from the autopsy room to the delivery room without washing in between. He ordered them to scrub with a basic solution before touching another patient. And within a single year, the death rate in that ward collapsed by more than 90%. The strange part is what came before that order. Semmelweis first tried plain soap and a nail brush. It helped, but not enough to kill the smell of decay still clinging to the skin. So he reached for something stronger. What he had stumbled into, without fully understanding it, was the outer edge of a truth that a small, greasy, unglamorous object had already been carrying quietly for thousands of years. Soap was never just a thing you used to get clean. It was one of the few inventions in human history that has been deciding, almost invisibly, who lives and who dies. To understand how something this small ended up with that kind of power, the story has to go back further than empires, further than written language itself, to a place where nobody was trying to invent anything at all. In Mesopotamia, in the region that is now southern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered clay tablets dating to around 2,800 years before the Common Era, describing a process of boiling fat with ash. The people writing those instructions were not chemists in any sense we would recognize. They were almost certainly just trying to get wool clean before it was woven into cloth. Somewhere along the way, someone noticed that when animal fat was heated together with the ashes of burned plants, the resulting paste did something water alone could never do.
Wow.
It lifted grease. It lifted grime.
Look at that.
It made fibers that had been stiff and soiled come out soft and pale again. There was no understanding yet of why. The chemistry behind that reaction, what we now call saponification, would not be explained for thousands of years. All they knew was that the result worked, and that was enough to write it down on clay and pass it forward. Making that ash and fat mixture was not a pleasant or a safe job. The alkali extracted from burned plants, what we would now recognize as an early form of lye, was caustic enough to burn skin and eyes on contact. And the boiling process filled workshops with thick, foul-smelling smoke that clung to clothing for days. There was no way to measure the strength of the alkali precisely, so early soap makers worked almost entirely by feel and experience, judging the mixture by its texture and smell rather than any kind of formula. A batch that was too weak did nothing. A batch that was too strong could blister hands and ruin fabric instead of cleaning it. This is part of why soap making slowly became its own specialized trade rather than something every household did on its own. And why, centuries later, cities that mastered the process reliably, places like Aleppo, Castile, and Marseille, were able to turn a difficult and unpleasant craft into a genuine source of regional wealth and pride. A popular legend claims that the word soap itself comes from a Roman tale of a hill called Mount Sapo, where animal sacrifices left fat and ash to wash down into the Tiber River, where women later noticed their laundry came out cleaner after rinsing in that water. It is a wonderful story, and it has been repeated for centuries. But historians have not been able to verify that a place called Mount Sapo ever actually existed. And most trace the word's true roots to older Celtic or Germanic languages instead. It is worth saying plainly that this is folklore, not history, because the real story does not need the myth to be remarkable. In Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, a medical text dated to around 1550 years before the Common Era, describes mixing animal and vegetable oils with alkaline salts to treat skin conditions and as a general cleansing agent. The Egyptians were not bathing with soap the way we do now, but they had already identified something the Babylonians had only stumbled toward, that this strange paste could be medicine as much as cleaner. For more than 2,000 years after that, Soap barely moved. It existed in scattered pockets, used here for wool, there for a skin ailment, occasionally for the kind of perfumed luxury only the wealthy could afford. The Romans themselves were lukewarm about it at first. Their preferred method of getting clean involved rubbing the body with oil and then scraping it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil, a practice that sounds almost more painful than dirty. It was not until physicians like Galen, writing in the 2nd century, began recommending soap for personal hygiene that attitudes in the Roman world started to shift. And even then, the soaps considered the finest were imported from Gaul and Germanic regions rather than made locally. Soap, in other words, spent its first several thousand years as a minor character in human history. The breakthrough that would change that came from a city most people today could not place on a map, but whose name is still stamped on bars of soap sold around the world. That city is Aleppo, in what is now Syria, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on Earth, sitting at a crossroads of trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia and beyond. During the Islamic Golden Age, between roughly the 8th and 13th centuries, chemists in cities like Aleppo refined the crude ash and fat method into something closer to an exact science. They combined olive oil with laurel oil and a reliable alkaline base. And the result was a hard, pale, long-lasting bar that produced rich foam and held its shape and scent far longer than anything made before it. This was the moment soap stopped being an accident of chemistry that happened to work and became a manufactured product with a recipe, a process, and eventually an export market. Aleppo's soap traveled west along trade and pilgrimage routes, reaching Mediterranean Europe through contact during and after the Crusades, carrying with it a method that 2 very different regions would each claim and refine as their own. The first of those regions was Castile, in Spain, where soap makers swapped the laurel oil for the abundant local olive oil and discovered a natural alkali called barilla, made from saltwort plants that grew along the Spanish coast, which produced an unusually pure soda ash. Castile's soap became so prized for its purity that, according to several historical accounts, the seeds of the barilla plant were considered valuable enough that smuggling them out of Spain could carry the penalty of death. The second region was Marseille, on the southern coast of France, where the craft took root by the 14th century and grew into a true industry. By the late 1600s, Marseille was home to a cluster of soap factories producing thousands of tons a year, and the trade had become important enough to attract the attention of the French crown itself. In 1688, King Louis XIV, acting through his minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, issued an edict that legally defined what could be called Marseille soap. Only pure olive oil could be used. Animal fat was banned outright. Producers who broke the rule 4 times faced banishment from the entire region of Provence. It is a striking thing to sit with, that a king once thought soap important enough to regulate it the way other monarchs regulated gold or salt, and that breaking the recipe could cost a craftsman his home. Soap had now gone from a household afterthought to a regulated trade good, moving along the same Mediterranean shipping lanes as wine, oil, and spices. And from there, it began traveling further still, into Northern Europe and across the Atlantic. But as soap expanded, it also revealed something that almost every valuable commodity in human history eventually reveals. The people who could afford to be clean and the people who could not were rarely the same people, and the gap between them carried real consequences. In England, the gap was not just about money. It was written directly into law. Starting in 1712, the English crown imposed a tax on soap so heavy that it roughly tripled the price of the cheapest, coarsest bars working families relied on. The tax stayed in place for nearly a century and a half, generating revenue on a scale comparable to alcohol duties today. And historians who have studied the period note that some soap makers left England entirely for the American colonies and for Ireland, where the tax did not apply, just to keep working. For ordinary households, cleanliness quite literally became something the government had decided they could not afford. It took until 1853, under the chancellorship of William Gladstone, for the soap tax to finally be repealed, freeing an entire industry, And, just as importantly, putting a basic hygiene product within reach of people who had been priced out of it for generations. That repeal landed at almost exactly the moment medicine needed it most. This is where Vienna belongs back in the story. Not as an isolated incident, but as part of a much larger pattern emerging across 19th century Europe and America, in which doctors, often ridiculed by their own colleagues, began connecting cleanliness to survival in ways that the rest of society was nowhere near ready to accept. Semmelweis's own breakthrough had come from tragedy. A close colleague of his, a doctor named Jakob Kolechka, died after accidentally cutting his hand with a scalpel during an autopsy, developing the exact same symptoms as the women dying of childbed fever. Semmelweis realized the two cases were connected and that something invisible, carried on the hands of the very physicians trying to help, was traveling from the autopsy table to the delivery bed. Semmelweis was not believed in his own lifetime. He never managed to convince the wider medical establishment that washing hands could be the difference between life and death, and his career collapsed under the weight of professional ridicule. He died in 1865 inside a Viennese mental asylum from an infected wound, the same kind of infection his own discovery might have prevented had anyone been willing to listen. His work was only properly honored decades later, once germ theory gave the rest of the world language to explain what he had already proven with raw numbers. It is one of the more uncomfortable truths in the history of soap that an idea capable of saving an enormous number of lives can sit right in front of an entire profession and still be dismissed for a generation, simply because no one wanted to believe doctors themselves might be the danger. The second half of the 19th century is when soap stopped being a craft and became an empire. And the man most responsible for that shift built his fortune in a small town in northern England before extending it into one of the most troubling chapters connected to this entire object. William Lever, born in Bolton, partnered with a local chemist to create a free lathering soap made with palm oil and glycerin rather than traditional animal tallow. He called it Sunlight Soap, and within a decade of its launch, it was being sold in well over 100 countries. To house his growing workforce, Lever built an entire model village near Liverpool called Port Sunlight, with proper housing, gardens, schools, and amenities that were genuinely ahead of their time for industrial workers in Britain. By every account, the people who worked in his English factories were treated about as well as industrial laborers anywhere in the world at that moment. The raw material that made all of it possible was palm oil, and palm oil meant Africa. In 1911, Lever's company secured an enormous concession of land in the Belgian Congo, roughly 750,000 hectares of palm groves, to guarantee a steady supply for his soap factories back home. What followed in a settlement called Leverville was almost the mirror opposite of Port Sunlight, research commissioned by Lever's own corporate successor, Unilever, and the trust that now preserves Port Sunlight's history has documented forced labor practices in the Congo operation, conditions that violated even the colonial government's own rules against coercion, and a working environment defined by harsh quotas and racial hierarchies that Lever himself expressed in writing at the time. Local communities who had grown and traded palm fruit on their own land for generations found themselves pushed into laboring for the company on what had effectively become company land, for wages that left little room to refuse. This is not a comfortable footnote. It is a documented part of how one of the most famous soap brands in the world built its global reach, verified not by activists alone, but by the very corporation that descended from it, which in recent years has opened its own archives to confront this history directly. The same bar of soap that brought affordable cleanliness to British factory workers was, on the other side of the world, tied to forced labor on the very land that supplied it. While Lever was building his empire in England, a very different and far less violent story was unfolding in Cincinnati, Ohio, inside the factories of a company called Procter & Gamble. In 1879, the company began selling a new white soap that, almost by chance it seemed, floated in water. For decades, the popular version of the story held that a worker had accidentally left a mixing machine running too long during a lunch break, whipping extra air into a batch that should have been discarded but was shipped out anyway, only for the company to be flooded with letters from customers asking for more of the soap that floated. It is a charming story, and it spread for generations, but it is not what actually happened. Company archives uncovered by Procter & Gamble's own historian in the early 2000s revealed that the chemist James Gamble had deliberately developed the floating formula as early as 1863, noting the discovery in his own work journal years before the soap was ever sold to the public. The soap was named Ivory after a Bible verse about ivory palaces, heard by company executive Harley Procter during a church sermon, and its early advertising boasted a purity rating of 99 44%, a number drawn from an actual independent laboratory analysis rather than an invented marketing slogan. It is a small but telling reminder that even the friendliest, most wholesome corner of this object's history comes with its own myth that needed correcting. A reminder that not every appealing story about soap turns out to be true. By the early 20th century, soap had become something almost nobody in the industrialized world thought twice about, sitting on every sink and in every laundry room. Its price low enough that the centuries of taxes, smuggling, royal edicts, and the lives spent producing the raw palm oil behind it had all but disappeared from public memory. Around that same period, the scientific case for why soap and hand hygiene mattered finally caught up with what Semmelweis had argued decades earlier and had been mocked for. Scientists, including Louis Pasteur and the surgeon Joseph Leister, helped establish germ theory as accepted medical fact rather than a fringe idea, giving doctors and the public alike a clear explanation for something soap had been quietly doing all along, removing the invisible organisms that water alone could rarely dislodge. Average life expectancy in industrialized countries climbed dramatically over the following decades. And while vaccines, clean water systems, and modern medicine all deserve enormous credit for that shift, public health historians consistently point to basic hygiene, soap included, as one of the foundational and most cost-effective pieces of that puzzle. And then it turned out to matter more than almost anyone expected. Not in a factory or a palace, but in households facing diseases that medicine alone could not fully stop. Today, public health organizations, including the World Health Organization and UNICEF, estimate that something as simple as washing hands with soap at key moments, after using the toilet, before eating, before preparing food, can cut the risk of diarrheal disease in young children by roughly 30 to 40%. And meaningfully reduce respiratory infections as well. UNICEF has gone as far as stating that building hand washing with soap into a routine habit can save more lives globally than almost any single vaccine. The world was reminded of exactly how much this small object still matters during the global coronavirus pandemic that began in 2020, when public health agencies around the planet spent months urging people to do something soap has been doing for nearly 5,000 years. Simply wash their hands properly and often. And yet, the same organizations report that billions of people worldwide still lack reliable access to soap and clean water at home, meaning the very same object that quietly reshaped the survival odds of an Austrian maternity ward in 1847 is still, right now, unevenly distributed across the planet in ways that cost lives every single day. The thing that once was taxed as a luxury in England is, in many places today, still effectively a luxury simply because of geography and infrastructure rather than law. The city that started all of this has lived through its own modern reckoning. Aleppo, the birthplace of the refined hard soap bar, saw most of its historic soap workshops damaged or destroyed during the Syrian civil war that began in the early 2010s. Of roughly 100 soap factories that once operated in the old city, only a small fraction remained standing in the years that followed, and many of the master soap makers who survived had to rebuild their craft from nothing, some relocating to Turkey or France just to keep a 1,000-year-old family trade alive. Despite all of that, in recent years, the United Nations Cultural Agency UNESCO formally recognized Aleppo soap as a piece of intangible cultural heritage, and artisans in the old city have slowly been reopening workshops, mixing the same olive and laurel oil recipe their ancestors used, drying the bars for months in towers stacked floor to ceiling the way it has always been done. The soap survived an empire's taxes, a king's edict, and a colonial labor system on another continent. And it has now survived a modern war as well, which says something about how stubborn this particular object has always been about refusing to disappear. There is an odd little linguistic fingerprint soap left behind in popular culture that most people have used without ever connecting it back to the object itself. In the 1930s, companies like Procter & Gamble began sponsoring daytime radio dramas aimed at homemakers, who were seen as the primary buyers of household cleaning products. These serialized shows, full of family drama and romantic entanglement, became so closely associated with their soap company sponsors that the entertainment press started calling them soap operas. A slightly mocking nickname that stuck so well, it eventually became the official name of an entire television genre that still airs today. It is a strange kind of legacy for an object that began its life as a way to clean wool in ancient Mesopotamia, to end up lending its name to decades of romantic plot twists on daytime television, without most viewers ever realizing where the phrase came from. There is something almost dizzying about tracing that line all the way through. A boiling pot of fat and ash in ancient Mesopotamia, meant only to clean wool, eventually became a bar regulated by a king of France, taxed nearly out of reach by the English crown, dismissed by doctors who refused to believe their own hands could carry death, built into a global empire, partly on the backs of forced laborers, half a world away from the factory floor that profited from their work, and accidentally mythologized by a company that quietly knew. The truth was less interesting than the legend. None of those chapters happened because soap is dramatic. They happened because soap is necessary. And necessity has always been one of the most reliable ways to reveal what a society values, who it is willing to exploit, and who it is willing to protect. The strange contradiction sitting at the center of all of this is that soap has never stopped being both completely ordinary and quietly enormous at the same time. It is cheap enough today that almost no one in a wealthy country thinks about its cost at all. Yet its absence remains a measurable cause of death in parts of the world without it. It once symbolized purity and biblical imagery on advertising posters, while its supply chain in colonial Africa symbolized something closer to the opposite. It was once worth regulating like a precious export, and now it is worth so little that hotels give it away for free in tiny unmarked bars that most guests never think twice about before throwing away. To most people, soap is just something you grab without looking, a bar or a bottle that disappears into a daily routine without ever asking for attention. To the history sitting underneath it, soap has been a tax revolt, a royal edict, a forgotten doctor's vindication arriving decades too late, a corporate myth quietly corrected by its own archives, and one of the most effective, least expensive tools human beings have ever had for keeping each other alive. It never demanded to be noticed. It just kept working in the background of nearly every major turning point it touched, asking for nothing in return except to be used. What everyday object do you think hides a history just as surprising as this one?